Go.
This is how lovers die. The river was life. It brought us together, married us.
It's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And they'll end up blowing up the dam. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear. They'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something. Because they could have stopped it. They should have stopped it long before it was started. I said, how do you let it get built and then you say they have a dam?
في النهاية أنا بقول لكم تاني وبقول للأشقاء في أثيوبيا بلاش إن إحنا نصل لمرحلة إنك أنت تمس نقطة مية من مصر.
The river was life. It brought us together, married us. Now we argue and fight like husband and wife.
In 1929, shortly after their independence from the United Kingdom, Egypt signed a treaty with Britain known as the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. To 1920s Britain, Egypt remained a crucial country to keep happy and stable, because the UK still retained direct control over the all-important Suez Canal between the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Even after the rest of Egypt's independence, for decades, the Suez Canal represented the quickest possible way for British vessels to reach India from the home island. And as such, wishing to placate Egypt and retain their colonial control over the canal, Britain's 1929-era treaty with Egypt effectively granted Egypt and Sudan the rights to all of the water in the Nile River. It even gave Egypt the right to veto any construction project on the Nile or any of its tributaries further upriver in any of the 10 other Nile countries that may interfere with the flow of water downstream into
They sat
Egypt.
and plowed. We walked and grazed our cows. Opposites attract. The river was life. It brought us together, married us.
First of all, River Nile is the longest river in the world. It has flown for generations from Lake Victoria in the south to the Mediterranean Sea in the north. When drawn on a map, the river seems to flow upwards rather than downwards, leading to queries as to how this river does it. More so, there are no other major rivers that follow this direction of south to north, thereby adding to the mystery. And here is how. Rivers flow from a high land to a low land under the influence of gravity while following a path of least resistance. River Nile, just like any other river, starts from a high land, in this case Lake Victoria, which happens to be in the south. It flows downwards towards the Mediterranean Sea, which is a lowland and happens to be in the north. Lake Victoria is located way higher up than Mediterranean Sea. It's at about 1,134 meters above sea level, while Mediterranean Sea is at the sea level, which is 0 meters. Therefore, water from the lake will naturally flow downwards towards the Mediterranean Sea due to gravity and fewer obstacles. The misconception of River Nile flowing upwards largely comes from the association of north with up, all highlands, and south with down, all lowlands, rather than what affects the flow of water, which is altitude and gravity.
Now we argue and fight like husband and wife. It wasn't complicated stuff. Our differences just caught up.
While the Blue Nile, its major tributary, has been well understood since ancient times, the main stem, also called the White Nile, has remained a mystery until modern times. For the longest time, Lake Victoria was considered the source of the Nile. This, however, neglects the fact that the lake itself is fed by major rivers. The longest one of these, the Kagera River, which itself has this tributary, and even this creek in the Rwandan mountains, competing for the title of the furthest source of the River Nile.
Tanzania has the largest portion of the lake at 49%, Uganda at 45%, and Kenya has the remaining 6%. The lake is known by many local names such as Namblolwe in Dholuo, Nalubale in Luganda, Nyanza in Kinyarwanda, and Ukerewe. However, it was renamed after Queen Victoria by British explorer John Hannings Speke in 1858. Rain is the main source of water for the lake. It accounts for 80% and rivers account for the rest. The largest river that flows into the lake is River Kagera in Uganda, though it starts from Burundi. The only outflow is River Nile on the northern shore of the lake near Jinja Town in Uganda. This makes the lake to be the main source of water for River Nile, which happens to be the longest river in the world. There are many other rivers that drain into the lake. The main rivers from Tanzania are Simiyu, Isanga, Magogo, Ruana, Mori, and Grumeti. From Kenya, they are Sio, Nzoia, Yala, Nyando, Awach, Kisian, Sondu Miriu, Kuja, and Mara. From Uganda, it's River Katonga. From Rwanda, it's River Nyabarongo. And from Burundi, it's River Kagera and Ruvuvu. The lake and its source rivers form the Lake Victoria Basin. The basin measures about 184,200 square kilometers. It is spread across 5 countries, which are Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi.
You see, as universally important as the Nile River is to Egypt, the river and all the water that flows through it does not begin in Egypt. Before the river even reaches Egypt, it stretches and winds for thousands of kilometers through 10 other countries first. The Nile has no true single starting place, but is fed by 2 primary tributary rivers, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile is fed by the waters of the African Great Lakes and roughly begins in Uganda, while the Blue Nile is fed by the vast waters originating in the high, rainy, and largely alpine climate-type Ethiopian highlands, the largest continuous area of high elevation found anywhere on the African continent. During the monsoon season in the Indian Ocean lasting through the summer between June and September, the towering Ethiopian mountains will catch the precipitation from the moisture-rich winds blowing into the continent, which often causes Lake Tana in the northwest corner of Ethiopia to overflow and spill water into the Blue Nile that runs out of it, sending a flood surge downriver clear through across Egypt and into the Mediterranean, a phenomenon that often puzzled ancient and classical era civilizations in Egypt, since the summer is also the driest part of the year in the Mediterranean with the least amount of rainfall. It is these summer floods through the Blue Nile that historically eroded enormous quantities of fertile soil from the temperate Ethiopian highlands, which then got carried downriver as silt, which then historically got deposited across the Egyptian floodplains like natural fertilizer when the surge moved further through the Nile and flooded. Eventually, the Blue and White Nile tributaries converge at the city of Khartoum in modern-day Sudan, and then join together to form the full Nile River from there all the way through Egypt and the Delta into the Mediterranean. But the 2 tributaries contribute vastly different levels of water into the Nile further downriver through Egypt. During the summer monsoon season in the Indian Ocean, the overflowing Blue Nile contributes an overwhelming 85% of all the water that makes its way down to Egypt through the Nile. Overall, throughout the entire course of an average year, the Blue Nile contributes roughly 59% of all the water that makes its way through Egypt, while the White Nile contributes the remaining 41%. Thus, the majority of the water in the Nile that flows through Egypt and supports all of Egyptian civilization has always begun in the Ethiopian highlands more than 1,200 kilometers away from Egypt's southernmost contemporary border. And now in the 21st century, Ethiopia would like to utilize this geographic advantage to help develop itself and increase its own prosperity. As the course of the Blue Nile slopes steeply down from the mountains of the Ethiopian highlands, the water running down the tributary contains a lot of violent rapids that possess a very high amount of kinetic energy. Maybe not an ideal situation for commercial navigation through the river, but a perfect scenario to capture the water's kinetic energy to spin a turbine to generate electricity. As such, there have been proposals and discussions going back decades within Ethiopia to construct hydroelectric power dams across their sections of the Blue Nile. But these proposals have always been fiercely resisted by every single government that has ever found itself in power further to the north in Cairo. The fears in Egypt have always been that if Ethiopia were to construct any dams across their sections of the Blue Nile, they could interrupt or even decrease the flows of precious water through the Nile downriver to Egypt, and therefore threaten Egypt's survival as a state. In 1978, when Ethiopia was very publicly considering building a dam along the Blue Nile with Soviet backing, the Egyptian president at the time, Anwar Sadat, responded with a thinly veiled threat when he said, "We are not going to wait to die of thirst in Egypt. We'll go to Ethiopia and die there instead."
Chapter 1: The Ethiopian Highlands. Sculptured by the immense forces from the inside of our planet, the Ethiopian highlands are the largest expanse of rugged terrain on the African continent. The mountains, volcanoes, and gorges are the product of an intense tectonic activity that has shaped Eastern Africa for the past 75 million years. Looking at a topographic map of Africa, we can discern several lines through the mountains and Great Lakes, which showcase the forces of the Great African Rift System, which is currently splitting the African tectonic plate into two. And these processes are also largely responsible for the rugged Ethiopian highlands. Moving apart at around 6 millimeters per year, the Somali and Nubian plate are drifting in opposite directions due to an unknown source in Earth's inner mantle. A thin, fragile, and rugged new crust is forming from the volcanic outflows between them, and this process, combined with a separate and more intense local uplift around present-day Ethiopia, has elevated this almost circular highland above the rest of Africa. To this day, the East African Rift keeps expanding and throughout the past couple of million years has created two pronounced subregions across the Ethiopian highlands. The northwestern section is referred to as the Abyssinian Massif, while its counterpart across the rift is called the Harar Massif. Both regions share many similarities with high precipitation and several mountains surpassing the 4,000 meter or 13,100 feet mark, but there are also some distinct differences. When it comes to setting records, for example, the Abyssinian Massif in the northeast outshines the Harar Massif in pretty much every geographical category. It is home to the tallest mountain of Ethiopia, with the 4,550 meter or 15,000 feet tall Ras Dashen, whose meltwater drains through the deepest gorge of Ethiopia and then powers the largest hydroelectric power plant of the country. A bit further south, in the next drainage basin, we can find the largest lake of Ethiopia, which also contributes the largest tributary to the River Nile. Every wet season between June and August, the monsoon over the Indian Ocean is pouring down on the Ethiopian highlands, increasing Lake Tana's outflow 50-fold, and seasonally flooding the banks of the River Nile over 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles downstream.
But just as the GERD increasingly became viewed as an existential necessity for Ethiopia to finally escape from its poverty and sharp internal divisions, it also began being simultaneously viewed as an existential threat towards Egypt's very survival. This was because once the dam had been finished being built in 2020, the Ethiopians would inevitably have to begin holding back the water supplies of the Blue Nile in order to fill up the massive reservoir half the size of Rhode Island behind it. The question on everybody's minds in Egypt was how long would the Ethiopians take to fill it? If they took their time with it and spent a couple decades to fill the reservoir up, as Egypt initially began insisting they do, they would only hold back a relatively small amount of water in the Blue Nile every year, and thus continue allowing the vast majority of the Blue Nile's water year-round to continue flowing down to Egypt. But on the other hand, if Ethiopia decided to fill up the reservoir very rapidly in a matter of only something like 5 years, then they would be holding back a massive amount of the Blue Nile's waters for all 5 of those years in order to do so. And Egypt would be left with greatly reduced water supplies for however long that process took. Egypt's situation during the reservoir's filling could also be made even worse during an unexpected period of drought, where rainfall levels and water volumes through the White Nile are lower than normal, and where Ethiopia continues holding water back in the Blue Nile to continue filling up the reservoir. Under a scenario like this, it is conceivable that Egypt could experience drastic cuts in their available water supply until the Gerd's reservoir is fully filled up. And if it happens that way, it will affect a lot more than just 102 million Egyptians drinking water and Egypt's scarce supplies of irrigation for farming. The Aswan High Dam in southern Egypt was constructed across the Nile back in the 1960s, which created behind it the huge reservoir known as Lake Nasser. This reservoir and dam has provided Egypt with similarly massive amounts of hydroelectricity as the Gerd will for Ethiopia, a total of about 2,100 megawatts that provides roughly 12% of all of Egypt's electricity needs. But if the Gerd in Ethiopia holds back a lot of water on the Blue Nile to fill up its reservoir, Egypt fears that it will result in the water levels of Lake Nasser decreasing, as less water arrives to replace what has already lost to high levels of evaporation in the desert. And if Lake Nasser's water levels decrease, it means that the Aswan High Dam won't have as much water available to run through its turbines to generate electricity. And that means that Egypt will have to replace the loss in power by importing more expensive raw energy inputs like coal, gas, or oil. A difficult financial decision to make for a country that is seemingly always struggling with an economic crisis. Because of these reasons, a 2021 environmental research study found that Egypt would stand to lose approximately $28 billion in agricultural output if the Ethiopians insisted on filling up the Gerd's reservoir in 5 years and Egypt did nothing to mitigate its associated water deficits. According to the same study, if Ethiopia spent 10 years to fill up the reservoir, then Egypt would still stand to lose approximately $17 billion in agricultural output.
But Egypt's problems, again, do not end there. 2018 was a pivotal moment for Egypt's mining sector. It was the year that Egypt went from being a gas importer to a net exporter. This was thanks to the start of gas production from the Zohr offshore field. According to Italian oil giant Eni, which has a 50% stake in the project, it is the largest field discovered on the Mediterranean shelf. Production and therefore exports grew steadily, peaking in 2022, when Egypt exported 8 million tons of LNG. But after that there was a drastic drop of 50% in 2023, and now it has come to the point where Egypt has completely stopped LNG exports since May. Again, regional instability is to blame. Quote, "Many ship owners have been navigating alternate routes, such as taking the longer voyages around the Cape of Good Hope. As a result, Egyptian exports have taken a hit," S&P Global analysts write. In addition, after the start of the Hamas war, Israel temporarily halted production from the Tamar field, from which gas was later sent to Egyptian liquefaction facilities and then re-exported. Yet most of the problems are at the Zohr field itself, where the operator is unable to deal with leaks in the system that allow water to enter. As a result, another source of revenue for Cairo has dried up, one that was generating up to $8 billion in profits by 2022. Hanging all over this is the problem of 2 million Palestinians crammed into the southern Gaza Strip, whom the Israeli authorities would most likely to see emigrate to Egypt or other Arab countries. Egypt doesn't want to hear about it, and given Cairo's mounting problems, it's hardly surprising. So how the country's ruling elites are navigating Egypt in these difficult times? Unfortunately, it's hard not to succumb to the illusion that it too can be counted as another Egyptian scourge.
And as Ethiopia continues to unilaterally fill the Gerd's reservoir and potentially goes on from there to build even more dams in the future, and as Egypt remains a fragile, water-insecure state that is vulnerable to external shocks like these, the risk of massive military escalation exploding across the Nile basin will continue to ratchet up and increase. Potential flashpoints that could trigger a greater conflict between them have already appeared. For decades, Ethiopia and Sudan have both clashed over the ownership of the Al-Fashqa Triangle, a fertile agricultural area nearby to the Gerd and its reservoir. Back in 2008, both sides had come to an agreement where Ethiopian farmers would till and work the land here, while Sudan would retain administrative authority over it. But that deal all came crashing down at the end of 2020, when the biggest war of the 21st century exploded within Ethiopia as the Tigray region rebelled against the central Ethiopian government in Addis Ababa. Sudan decided to forcibly expel the Ethiopian farmers from the Al-Fashqa Triangle and consolidate its control as Ethiopia descended further into civil war and chaos, and so lacked any viable method to retaliate. In June of 2022, the Ethiopian military allegedly opened fire in the region and shot dead 7 Sudanese soldiers and a civilian. And as the war in Tigray began to rage and fester into the bloodiest conflict of the entire 21st century within Ethiopia, the central government began accusing the Egyptians of covertly funneling weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the rebel forces in the Tigray region and other armed groups opposed to the Ethiopian government. The Tigray War, lasting between 2020 and 2022, ultimately became a sort of proxy war, wherein the Egyptian government allegedly supplied the rebels to remove the Ethiopian government from power and hopefully install a new government in its place, who would be more willing to enter into negotiations with Cairo over the Gerd, its reservoir, and the future of the Nile. But by 2022, the war's ferocity had reached unprecedented levels not seen before in the 21st century. Rampant genocides and ethnic cleansings were carried out by every one of the sides involved. Totalitarian Eritrea's modern-day slave army invaded the Tigray region at the request of the Ethiopian government, while the Tigray rebel forces themselves came close to beating them all back and capturing the Ethiopian capital itself in Addis Ababa. Hundreds of thousands of troops on all sides were mobilized to fight against each other, and by the conflict's conclusion, after 2 years of near total genocidal war, an estimated 600,000 people lay dead, marking it as the deadliest human conflict that began in the 21st century. This catastrophic, tragic, and massive conflict largely escaped most of the coverage in the Western world because at about the same time as it was raging in 2022, the Russians invaded Ukraine and brought all of the West's eyes to bear over there instead. But for the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Tigray War was even bigger and even worse than what has been happening in Ukraine.
Tensions have escalated as Somalia has forged closer ties with Ethiopia's other rival, Egypt. Now, last month, Cairo sent military aid to Mogadishu to mark the strengthening of ties. Egypt also reportedly plans to send up to 5,000 soldiers to join a new-look African Union force in Somalia at the end of the year, with another 5,000 to be deployed separately. An African Union force has been in Somalia since 2007 to help the government fight the Islamist group Al-Shabaab. Up to 10,000 Ethiopian troops are a part of the force. However, Somalia has announced that they cannot be involved in the new mission until Ethiopia cancels its deal with Somaliland. Ethiopia and Egypt, meanwhile, have been at loggerheads for years over Addis Ababa's vast dam project on the Nile River. Egypt has accused Ethiopia of threatening its supply of water following the construction of the dam. Now, mediator Turkey has been facilitating indirect talks between Ethiopia and Somalia to try to resolve the dispute. But there has been no significant breakthrough after 2 rounds of talks. The third round of talks are scheduled to take place in Ankara on the 17th of September.
Just behind the city boundaries of Addis Ababa, the diagonal cut of the Great African Rift penetrates through the Ethiopian highlands and has created a landscape of many lakes, forested mountain slopes, and canyons in its path. On the other side of the roughly 100-kilometer or 60-mile wide gap, now on the newly formed Somali tectonic plate, we are greeted yet again by the vast table mountains and canyons, which are stretching in all directions. Across this part of the highlands, very few pointy summits can be made out, and instead flat plateaus at elevations surpassing 2,000 meters or 6,600 feet, with steep and narrow gorges are the norm. This landscape of volcanic origin was once a lot more pointy, but millions of years of glaciation have done their work, flattening out the summits and carving deep meltwater outlets in between them. Going back to the Great African Rift, which is penetrating the Ethiopian highlands, and following the rift northwards, the fault line appears to be opening up towards the Red Sea coast, from where the rift continues into 2 different directions along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. At this junction, the land abruptly drops flat to the sea level, creating one of the most unique and inhospitable landscapes of the planet, leading us to Chapter 2, the Afar Triangle. At the tri-point intersection of the Nubian, Somali and Arabian plates, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth has formed, with its scorching heat challenging anybody who dares to enter. The Afar Triangle, as this region is known, lies at or below the sea level and stretches from central Ethiopia to central Eritrea and across to western Somalia, entirely encompassing the country of Djibouti. This depression is by far the most volcanically active region of the Horn and full of peculiar features. Having been spared by the forces of glaciation, many of the volcanic cones remain intact and are now sticking out of the otherwise flat landscape. Several of these volcanoes are still active today, with 13 of these having erupted in the last 200 years. The most notable of these is the Erta Ale in the north of the triangle, which has continuously erupted for almost 60 years now. The constant lava outflow of the Erta Ale regularly overflow, covering the surroundings of the shield volcano with fresh basaltic rock. In the center of the cone, a continuous lava lake has been simmering since the beginning of the 20th century. It is one of only 8 exposed lava lakes on the globe and holds the distinction of being the longest lasting continuous lava lake on the planet. The Erta Ale sits in the middle of the Danakil Depression, which is widely regarded as one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. The seemingly extraterrestrial valley holds the undisputed year-round average temperature record at 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and daytime temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit on a regular basis, putting places like Death Valley in California to shame. Yet, this extreme temperature isn't even the most challenging aspect of trying to live inside the Danakil Depression. Any water finding its way into the bowl, which lies 125 meters or 410 feet below the sea level, evaporates almost immediately, creating a thick and impenetrable salt crust. At places where water does manage to stay around for a bit, it mixes with the toxic sulfuric and chloride gases and minerals, byproducts of the heavy volcanic activity, creating highly acidic and colorful ponds, ready to dissolve any organic matter which may enter it. Paradoxically, however, it is in this depression, though in a little less hostile section, where archaeologists found the most astonishing skeleton. Now nicknamed Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis bones have been dated back to 3.3 million years ago, roughly to the time of the earliest stone tools which have been found to be made for hominid use, supporting the theory that modern humans may have their origin in this very region. At 125 meters below the sea level, the Danakil Depression is already the 6th lowest point on Earth's surface, but it isn't even the lowest point in the Afar region. That title belongs to Lake Assal, situated about 250 kilometers or 150 miles southeast on the other side of the Afar Depression within Djibouti. Plunging to a depth of 155 meters or 510 feet below the sea level, Lake Assal is the lowest point in Africa. Like many other lakes below the sea level, its waters have no outflow, and constant evaporation causes them to become hypersaline. Climbing out of the depression to the east again, we are leaving the 3rd smallest country of continental Africa behind, and the 3,330 kilometer or 2,070 mile long Somali coast starts wrapping around the easternmost point of the continent. To find the first land suitable for basic agriculture, we have to travel over 1,000 kilometers further south, where the first permanent rivers are crossing the landscape. Coming down from the Ethiopian Hara Massif, the Shabelle River crosses the Somali border around halfway down and makes its way straight to the Indian Ocean. Elevated land at the coast, however, makes the river take a sharp southward turn before reaching Mogadishu and transports the waters over 500 kilometers parallel to the Indian Ocean coast. Just before draining into the ocean, the river attributes to the other major river of the region, the Jabu River, whose drainage basin together spark the only agriculturally viable land of Somalia.
It brought us together, married us.
Other linguists consider the Horn of Africa to be the original homeland of the Proto-Afroasiatic language, as it is considered the region the Afroasiatic language family displays the greatest diversity, a sign often viewed to represent a geographic origin. Cushitic populations most likely formed and started migrating out of the Nile Valley in prehistory. Lasgil, ancient cave paintings in northern Somalia, attest to the first signs of a population believed to be ancestral to the Afro-Asiatic speakers in the Horn of Africa. In an excellent state of preservation, the rock art depicts wild animals and decorated cattle like cows and bulls. They also feature herders, possibly pastoral nomads who were the creators of the paintings. The land of Punt was an ancient kingdom and trading partner of Egypt, known for producing and exporting gold, aromatic resins, black wood, ebony, ivory, and wild animals. The exact location of Punt is still debated by historians, but most scholars today believe Punt was situated to the southeast of Egypt, most likely in the coastal region of modern Djibouti, Somalia, northeast Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Red Sea littoral of Sudan.